I have filed 11 dismissal notices in my career as palace seneschal, and I have never once lost sleep over any of them. Dismissing a nanny is administrative work. You note the date, the cause, the terms of the severance agreement, and you seal the document with the palace's secondary cipher. It takes perhaps 20 minutes, and then it is done. 12th notice took me 4 months to write. I should say that plainly, because I am aware that nothing else I record here will make sense unless I establish it. I, Sevet Orain, Palace Seneschal of the Oriath Inner Court, second rank, licensed administrator of the imperial household since the 17th year of the Emperor Vareth Solune's reign, required 4 calendar months to complete a single dismissal notice. The delay was not negligence, it was not illness, it was not a clerical error or a procedural dispute. It was the fact that every time I sat down to write the notice, I could not determine with confidence that I had witnessed what I thought I witnessed, and I have always refused, to enter into the official record anything I cannot personally verify, so I kept watching. And the longer I watched, the less I understood what I was watching, and the less I understood it, the more certain I became that it was, without question, the most important thing I had ever seen inside a palace. That is the only preamble I will offer. Here is the record. The nursery crisis began, by official count, 17 months before the events I am describing. The emperor's youngest daughter, Leva Selune, 3 years old when her primary caretaker was dismissed for cause. A separate matter, unrelated to what followed, and the court entered the process of appointment that governs the placement of all royal attendants. It is, in ordinary circumstances, a routine matter. We maintain a registry of certified caretakers, assessed by the Imperial Behavioral Institute on a 5-tier competency scale. Tier 1 candidates are assigned to the heir apparent, Tier 2 to the secondary royals. Leva, being the emperor's 4th child and the youngest by 11 years, received Tier 2 placement as standard. The first nanny lasted 6 days. I will not record, for every subsequent appointment, the precise duration. It is sufficient to say that, over the following 17 months, I processed 11 placements and 11 dismissals, each one following a pattern so consistent it began to feel, by the end, less like bureaucratic chaos and more like the palace itself was demonstrating a theorem. The nanny would arrive. The nanny would be assessed as competent, warm, and experienced, because they were. Every one of them was exactly as described. The nanny would enter the nursery. Leva would accept their presence for between 6 hours and 9 days, depending on the individual. And then, at some point in the late evening, it was nearly always the late evening, in the 3rd and 5th bell of the night cycle, the child would begin to scream. I do not use the word loosely. I have been in this palace for 22 years, and I have heard a great many sounds, and what Leva Selune produced in those hours was unlike anything in my experience. It was not the crying of a distressed child. It was not a tantrum. It was a sustained, escalating sound of pure and total anguish that passed through the nursery's crystal walls and down 2 inner corridors, and administrative offices where I worked late, and it did not stop. Sometimes it lasted 2 hours. Once, in the 9th month, it lasted 4 hours and 40 minutes, at which point Leva lost her voice entirely and simply lay open-mouthed on the nursery floor in silence. And the nanny, a 17-year veteran of the Institute's Tier 1 program, walked to my office and told me she would not go back in. I had her replacement arranged by morning. I had no other answer. Physicians came. The Imperial Behavioral Institute sent its senior consultant, a specialist named Drath Vune, whose reputation preceded him by some distance. He spent 3 days observing Leva through the nursery's observation glass, made 9 pages of notes, and submitted a report recommending a protocol that combined structured sensory engagement with graduated attachments, exercises, and a proprietary sound-dampening methodology he had developed for use with high-distress royal minors. We implemented the protocol. The night screaming continued. Drath Vune returned, revised the protocol, submitted a supplementary report, and billed the palace for an additional consultation fee. I paid it without comment. The screaming continued. The emperor, and I record this only because it is relevant to what follows, did not dismiss the matter. I want to be clear about that, because I think the easier narrative is to cast the emperor as indifferent, and that is not accurate. Vareth Saloon came to the nursery wing 3 times in those 17 months. He sat outside the door during the fourth and longest episode. He stood in the hallway and listened to his daughter scream for 4 hours and 40 minutes. And when it was over, he did not issue any order or demand any report. He simply walked back to his apartments in silence. His chamberlain told me afterward that the emperor did not sleep that night. What the emperor did not do, what none of us did, and I include myself, and Drath Vune, and all 11 nannies, was notice the janitor. Dael Morrow had been assigned to the nursery wing for 3 years. I had to look this up when it became relevant. I am not proud of that, but I am recording it honestly. He had been in the wing for 3 years, and I processed the roster assignments for every staff member in the inner palace. Could not have told you his name without consulting the personnel files. He was the floor cleaner. He came in at the 4th bell of the morning, before the nursery staff arrived, and he mopped the corridor outside the nursery suite, the waiting antechamber, and the small service hallway that ran behind the laundry room. He was finished before the first nanny arrived for the day shift. He did not interact with the nursery staff. He did not enter the nursery itself unless specifically called to deal with a cleaning matter. He was, in the terminology of the court, invisible. He was human. I record that as a fact, not a distinction. There are 14 humans in the inner palace staff, and Dael Morrow was not unusual among them in any way that I was aware of. He was perhaps 48 years old. I confirmed this from his personnel file, with gray at his temples and a way of moving that suggested someone who had been on his feet for long stretches of time for a great many years. His file noted that he had previously worked as a licensed residential care technician in a human settlement on the Outer Rim, which is a category of employment I had not had occasion to research. The file also noted, in a single line under personal history, that he was the parent of one child, female, aged 22. There was no record of a co-parent. That was all the file said. He had received 4 performance assessments in 3 years. All 4 rated him satisfactory. He had never been cited for a breach of protocol. He had never requested a meeting with my office. He had never, to my knowledge, spoken to anyone above the level of the head of grounds maintenance. And even those conversations, according to the grounds supervisor's notes, were brief and practical. I had in 3 years looked at him once. He had been in the corridor when I walked past on my way to a meeting, and I had registered. In the way one registers these things, without quite seeing them, a human man with a mop, stepping to one side to let me pass. I did not stop. I did not speak to him. He stepped back to his work. That was the full extent of our acquaintance, before the night of the 14th day of the 8th month, 31st year of the emperor's reign. I was working late because of the dismissal notice. 11 notices completed, and the 12th was proving intractable. Not because the facts were in dispute, but because the current nanny, a woman named Eris Tovath, who had come with the Institute's highest personal recommendation, had been in the position only 9 days, and I was aware that if I dismissed her, I would have to update the registry, notify the Institute, and begin the placement process again, and the placement process had begun to feel, by this point, less like a procedure and more like a demonstration of something I did not want to name. So I was at my desk at the 5th bell of the night cycle, with the dismissal notice open on my screen and the cursor at the end of the cause of departure field, and I was staring at it. That was when the screaming stopped. It had been going for perhaps an hour. I had tracked it in the way one tracks a sound that has become part of the environment, the way you track the hum of a ventilation system, or the percussion of wind against the corridor windows. It had been there, and then it was not there, and the absence was so complete and so unexpected that I sat perfectly still for approximately 30 seconds, waiting for it to resume. It did not resume. I got up from my desk. I am not entirely certain why. There was no administrative reason for me to leave my office. The nursery was my jurisdiction, only in the sense that the personnel attached to it, my jurisdiction. The child herself was not my concern. She was the concern of the nanny, and ultimately of the emperor. But the silence was so anomalous, so out of pattern with everything the previous 17 months had established, that I found myself in the corridor before I had made a conscious decision to move. The nursery wing is 4 corridors from the administrative offices. I walked them in the dark. The night cycle dims the palace corridors to a low, amber, just enough to navigate, and I arrived at the nursery suite without passing anyone. The nanny's antechamber was empty. Heiress Tovoth's duty bag was on the chair by the door, which told me she was present somewhere, but the antechamber itself was unoccupied. The nursery suite has an observation window set into the wall beside the main door. It is a long panel of treated crystal, approximately 1 meter wide and 1.5 meters tall, designed so that caretakers and physicians can observe the child without entering the room. I have looked through it perhaps 4 times in my career. I looked through it that night. The nursery was lit by the room's night setting, a very soft blue-white glow from the panels set low along the wall, not bright enough to disrupt sleep but sufficient for observation. Levade's sleeping platform was in the center of the room, under the window that looked out over the Veth garden. The platform was empty. Leva was on the floor. She was seated on the nursery floor, with her back against the platform's base and her legs extended in front of her. And she was not screaming. She was not crying. She was looking at something in the narrow space to her left, and her expression, and I am recording this precisely because I have thought about it many times since, was the expression of a child who has found something they were not expecting to find and have not yet decided what to make of it. What she was looking at was Dael Morrow. He was sitting on the floor beside her. He was sitting on the cold crystal floor of the imperial nursery, cross-legged, in his work uniform. The gray coverall with the palace grounds insignia on the left breast, the kind that picks up every scuff and stain from a day's worth of corridor work. And he was looking not at the child, but at something in his hands. He had a cleaning rag. It was one of the standard issue white fiber rags that the ground staff carry, and he had folded it into a shape. Could not at first identify the shape. The observation window's angle was slightly oblique. Then he held it up and rotated it slightly, and I saw that it was an animal, a small 4-legged animal, with 2 tall ears folded up from the body, rendered in white cleaning fiber, a rabbit, or whatever a rabbit becomes when someone who has folded one 1,000 times makes it quickly from a cloth rag in a dim room for a child they can see is watching them. He set it down on the floor between them. He did not give it to her. He did not present it or hold it out. He simply placed it on the floor between his knee and hers, in the way you set something down when you are making space for it, and not making an offer of it. And then he looked back at the middle distance. Leva looked at the rag rabbit. The rag rabbit was approximately 12 centimeters tall. It was not beautiful. It was a cleaning rag. It had been folded by a man who had probably done this once for his own daughter, 2 years ago or more, and had not forgotten how. Then Dael began to hum. I cannot replicate the sound in this record. I can say that it was quiet. Quiet enough that I could not hear it through the observation glass, only infer it from the slight movement in his jaw and the way his chest shifted with the breath of it. I could see it more than I could hear it. It was a slow thing, whatever it was, with a shape that rose and fell in a way that was entirely unlike the palace's sound environment. I had worked in this palace for 22 years, and I had heard music, formal music, ceremony music, the composed processional scores that accompany the emperor's state occasions. And this was not that. This was something a person hums to themselves, something worn smooth by repetition, something that belongs to a particular hour of a particular kind of night, the kind of night where a small person cannot sleep and needs the sound of someone nearby who is not alarmed. Reached out and touched the rag rabbit with one finger. She did not pick it up. She touched it. She pressed the tip of one small finger against the folded ear and held it there. And then she looked at Dael, and Dael did not look back at her. He was still looking at the middle distance, still humming. His hands were resting on his knees. Leva looked at her finger on the rag rabbit's ear. She looked at Dael. She looked at the rag rabbit again. Then she shifted, the careful, deliberate shifting of a very small child relocating without wanting to disturb something, and she leaned against Dael's arm. He did not move. He did not adjust. He did not put his arm around her or speak to her or look down. He simply remained where he was, and she remained leaning against him, and after perhaps 3 minutes her eyes closed. She was asleep in 5. I stood at the observation glass for a long time after that. I am not certain how long. Eventually, Dael shifted very slowly, extracted himself with the care of someone who has done this before. Extracted himself the way a person extracts themselves from a sleeping child. When they know the weight and the balance of it. When they know exactly how slow to be. And he got to his feet. He looked down at her for a moment. Then he picked up his cleaning rag. Not the rabbit, the other one, the one he'd been carrying for the work. And he walked to the service door at the back of the nursery and let himself out. Leva did not wake. I went back to my desk and sat down. The dismissal notice was still open on my screen. I stared at it for a long time. Then I closed it without saving. I left it unfinished for 4 months. What I did instead was observe. This requires some explanation, because observing Dael Morrow turned out to be a more deliberate act than it sounds. He was not someone the palace had any apparatus for noticing. He arrived at the 4th bell. He cleaned the corridor. He left before the day staff arrived. He did not linger. He did not seek attention. I had to arrange for the nursery's observation record to be flagged for review during his shift hours. And even then it took me 3 days to calibrate, because the observation system was not designed to track floor cleaning staff. It was designed to track the child and the nannies. And Dael moved in and out of frame in the peripheral spaces that the system was not recording. I want to note what I observed over those 4 months, because it bears directly on the record. Dael Morrow did not begin sitting with Leva on any particular night. He had, I believe, been doing it for some time before the night I first noticed. The observation records, once I reviewed them thoroughly, showed evidence going back at least 6 weeks. A child who had been screaming every night, until the 5th bell suddenly quiet by the 3rd, on multiple occasions, during the hours Dael was in the corridor. I had not connected this. No one had. We had been counting the screaming episodes and filing them in the distress log, and we had not thought to note the occasions when the screaming ended earlier than expected, because the pattern was screaming until dawn, and any deviation was absorbed into the assumption that the child had simply exhausted herself. She had not exhausted herself. She had been sitting on the floor with the janitor. Over 4 months, I observed 11 incidents. In 9 of them, the pattern was the same. Leva woke and began distress vocalizations. The nanny on duty attempted the prescribed intervention protocols. The protocols failed. The nanny eventually withdrew to the antechamber, or the side room, never abandoning the post, simply removing the additional stimulus, as Drath Viun's protocol instructed. And at some point during this period, Dael would be in the corridor, hear the child, and come in. He never asked permission. I want to record this carefully, because it is both the point and the complication. There is no provision in the palace protocol for a floor cleaning staff member to enter the imperial nursery unescorted during a distress episode. No such scenario had been anticipated because no such scenario had occurred. Dael did not enter the nursery with any apparent awareness that he was doing something unusual. He simply heard a child who could not sleep and went in, as if it were the obvious thing to do. As if there were no other reasonable response to a child crying in a room he was passing. In the remaining 2 incidents, Leva was not yet in full distress when he arrived. In one of these, she was sitting on the floor already, playing with a small toy animal. And she looked up when he came through the service door with the cleaning supplies and said, "I have the audio from the nursery's sound record, and I have reviewed it." She said nothing. She simply looked at him, and he looked at her. And then he sat down on the floor, and she went back to her toy, and they sat together in the pale blue-white glow of the nursery night panels for 40 minutes until she was ready to sleep. He did not, in any of the 11 incidents, speak to her at length. He said, occasionally, short things. The kind of short things one says in the dark when a small person is very tired and nearly asleep. Things like "there you are," or "you're all right," or "it's cold down here, isn't it?" Said in the flat, tired, kind voice of someone for whom these sentences are not a performance. They are simply the sentences. The ones that come when you have spent enough nights on the floor beside someone small who cannot tell you what is wrong. The rag rabbit appeared every time. Sometimes she had it waiting for him. She had taken to keeping it on the floor beside her sleeping platform, rather than on the platform itself, in the space where he sat. In one incident, he arrived to find her holding it already, pressed against her chest, watching the service door. She was watching the service door the way you watch a door when you are waiting for someone, and when he came through it, she looked at him in a way I cannot accurately describe, and will therefore simply note. I submitted my report to the Emperor in the 5th month. I had debated the form of it for some time. A seneschal's report is a document of record. It must be factual, specific, and free of conjecture. I am not a physician or a behavioral specialist, and I was careful not to characterize what I had observed in terms that exceeded my competence. What I submitted was a factual account of 11 incidents, with timestamps, with the observation record attached, with a note on the observation system's limitations and my confidence rating for each incident. I did not offer a theory. I did not recommend a course of action. I stated that the Emperor's youngest daughter was sleeping through the night in the presence of a member of the floor cleaning staff, and that this had been occurring for a period I could document as at least 6 weeks, and probably longer. I noted that his name was Dael Morrow. I noted that he was human. I noted that he was 48 years old and had been on the nursery wing staff 3 years and had received 4 satisfactory performance assessments. I noted the line in his personnel file about his daughter. I submitted the report at the first bell of the morning and spent the following 4 hours in a state that I will describe for the official record as administrative uncertainty, and which I will describe off the record as something more closely resembling fear. I did not know what the Emperor would do with the information. I did not know whether I had done something right or something that would end my career. I had bypassed 3 layers of normal reporting procedure by going directly to the Emperor, because I could not identify which of those 3 layers would have known what to do with what I was telling them. At the 5th bell, the Emperor's chamberlain messaged my office. The Emperor would visit the nursery wing at the 3rd bell of the following morning. I was to arrange that the floor cleaning staff be permitted to work their normal schedule. Nothing else was to be altered. I spent the night at my desk. The 3rd bell of the following morning fell at a point in the night cycle when the palace corridors are empty. Only sounds are the ventilation system and, occasionally, the settlement sounds of very old crystal architecture adjusting to the temperature differential between the heated interior and the cold of the upper atmosphere. I stood at the end of the nursery corridor, and the Emperor stood beside me, and we both stood in the amber dark and waited. Dael came from the far end of the corridor at his usual time. He had his cart, the standard rolling supply cart, gray, with the palace grounds insignia. And he moved at the pace of someone doing familiar work in familiar hours, the slightly slowed, economic pace of a man who has been on his feet since before the 1st bell and has calibrated the rate of his movement to last until the shift ends. He had not been told the Emperor would be present. I had deliberated about this extensively, and concluded that telling him would alter the observation in ways I could not control, and I had obtained the Emperor's agreement to this approach. Dael reached the nursery corridor and turned into it and saw us. He stopped. He looked at me and then at the Emperor, and I watched him identify the Emperor, which took approximately 2 seconds. I watched the recognition move across his face, in the way recognition of an Emperor moves across a person's face when they encounter him in a corridor at 3 in the morning unexpectedly. First the double take, then the certainty, then a kind of stillness that is not quite composure but is trying to be. He said, "Good morning." He said it the way you say good morning to someone you've passed in a corridor 100 times and are startled to find standing in front of you, flexively, and with the slight upward note at the end that means you are aware it may not be exactly the right thing to say in this context. The Emperor said, "Good morning," and then, "Please, don't stop on my account." Dael looked at him for a moment, then he nodded once, and continued with his cart to the service entrance of the nursery. The Emperor followed him. I followed the Emperor. The nursery was in its night configuration. Heiress Tovath had been dismissed 2 months prior, the process now officially suspended pending the outcome of my report. And Leva had been in the care of a rotating senior attendant on a short-term arrangement that was costing the palace a considerable sum, and was, by the attendant's own account, unnecessary, because Leva had stopped screaming. The senior attendant confirmed this in her weekly notes. She wrote, and I have these notes in the record, I do not know why she is sleeping. Whatever changed, it is still changing. The senior attendant was in the antechamber when we arrived. She stood when the emperor entered, and he put up his hand immediately, and she sat back down. He gestured toward the observation window. From the window, we could see the nursery. Leva was on the floor in her sleeping clothes, the rag rabbit in her hands. Shh. Watching the service door with the fixed attention of someone who is waiting for something they are confident is coming. The service door opened, and Dael came in with a mop and a bucket. He set the bucket down by the wall and leaned the mop handle against it, and then at Leva. She looked at him. This was apparently the extent of what was required by way of greeting. He crossed to his side of the floor and sat down. Leva crawled to her position. She had a position, I could see that now, a specific distance from his left knee that she had determined was the correct one, and settled herself. Dael did not hum immediately. He sat for a while. He reached into the pocket of his coverall and produced a second rag, and he began to fold it in the unhurried way of someone with time and familiar materials. The rabbit took shape in approximately 90 seconds. He set it on the floor between them. Leva picked it up. She picked this one up immediately, without the hesitation of the first night, because the first rabbit was already in her hands, and this one was new, and she examined it with the close attention of someone conducting a comparison. Then she looked at Dael and said something. The nursery's audio pickup is calibrated for a child's distress and not for quiet conversation. I could not make out the words, but Dael heard her, and he said something back, short, flat, the voice he used in the dark, and she appeared satisfied with this. And she leaned against his arm, and Dael began to hum. I looked at the emperor. He was standing with his arms at his sides, and his hands loose, which is not how the emperor of the Oriath court normally stands. He stands in formal context, with his hands behind his back, or at rest on the frame of whatever he is seated upon. He was not doing any of that. He was standing with his hands loose at his sides, and his face turned toward the observation glass. And I am a seneschal, not a physician, and I am not qualified to make physiological assessments. So I will simply record that the muscles around his eyes and jaw were different from how I normally observed them. We stood at the glass for 43 minutes. Leva went to sleep in 11, and slept the remaining 32 without waking. Dael sat with her until she was deeply enough under, then extracted himself with the same slow, careful competence I had watched 11 times before, and he stood and looked at her, sleeping on the floor beside the rag rabbits. There were 2 of them now. She had one in each hand. He picked up the mop. The emperor met him in the corridor. I stood at a distance, close enough to observe, far enough not to be a presence in it. The corridor was empty except for the 3 of us, and the amber night lights, and the sound of the ventilation. The emperor said, "She's been sleeping." Dael said, "She has." The emperor said, "For how long?" Dael said, "A while." And then after a pause, since around the time the days got shorter, she noticed the light changing outside the nursery window. Unsettled her. Children notice those things. He said this matter-of-factly, not as if he were explaining something complicated, but as if he were explaining something that seemed to him obvious, and he was not sure why it hadn't been obvious before. The emperor was quiet for a moment. He said, "The behavioral specialist said." Dael said, "I know what the reports said." The senior attendant showed me, after a while. He did not apologize for this. He seemed to consider it a thing that had happened, not a thing requiring comment. The emperor said, "Did they help?" Dael said, "No." The emperor said, "What did?" Dael looked at him. It was the direct, assessing look of a man who is not in the habit of speaking to emperors and has not yet adjusted his register to account for that. He said, "She needed someone to sit with her. That's all. She didn't need treatment. She needed someone to just." He paused, and he looked back toward the nursery door. "Just be there on the floor, not doing anything, not trying." The emperor said, "You have a daughter." It was not a question. I had included this in the report. Dael said, "I do. She's grown." He paused again. He stopped. He started again. "My daughter couldn't sleep either when she was small. There was a period of maybe 2 years where she just couldn't. We tried everything. And eventually I just started sitting with her, on the floor of her room. I'd hum the old songs, the ones my mother used to sing when I was little. Eventually it worked. I don't know why it works. I just know that it does. The Emperor said. Why didn't you tell anyone you were doing this? Dael said. It didn't occur to me that it was something to tell anyone. I was cleaning the corridor, and I heard her crying, and I went in. Every night for 6 weeks. For a while longer than that, probably. She was upset long before the screaming started. The screaming was already late in the process. He said this not with any judgment in his voice. He said it in the voice of someone reporting a fact about a thing he has seen before. The Emperor said, I didn't know. Dael said, no. He said it without accusation. It was simply true. There was a long quiet in the corridor. The ventilation ran its course. The amber light held. The Emperor said, I want to offer you something. A formal appointment. The title of Imperial Household Companion for Leva, with the rank and compensation that goes with it, your own suite in the East Wing, your own schedule. Dael looked at him steadily. He said, appreciate that, I do. Then he said, but I'm going to keep the mop. The Emperor said. Dael said, I'll stay. I'll come in the mornings. I'll sit with her if she needs it. But I'd like to keep the corridor assignment. Keep the cart. He seemed to think this required a small explanation, and he gave one. I'm not a companion. I'm not trained for that. I wouldn't know what to do with a suite and a rank and a schedule. I know what to do with a mop and a child who can't sleep. He said this simply, and without apology. I know what I'm good at. The Emperor looked at him for a long time. Then he said, then you'll keep the corridor assignment. And the cart. And you will, with your permission, also have the access code to the nursery at any hour you need it, and your name on the attendant roster as, what would you call it? Dael thought for a moment. He said, night maintenance. The Emperor said, night maintenance. That works, Dael said. The Emperor nodded. And then he did something I have witnessed precisely twice in 22 years of palace service. He bowed. It was not the formal bow of ceremony. It was the brief, deliberate incline of the head that one offers to a person you regard. He offered it to Dael Morrow, who was holding a mop handle in a corridor in the small hours of the morning. And then he turned and walked back toward the imperial apartments. Dael looked at the nursery door for a moment. Then he finished mopping the corridor. I completed the 12th dismissal notice the following morning. It was for Heiress Tovath, who had been placed in administrative suspension 2 months prior and deserved the resolution. Wrote it cleanly and sealed it, and entered it into the record. Then I opened a new file and began the document that would become this record. I have been writing it for 3 months. I am finishing it now because everything that needed to happen has happened, and what remains is simply a matter of being accurate. I will say, because this is a record, and records should say the true thing. I do not understand exactly what Dael Morrow did. I am aware that this is a strange admission from a palace seneschal. Function is precisely to understand what happens in the palace. But I have reviewed the behavioral literature that Drathviun cited in his 9 pages of notes, and I have consulted 3 additional specialists on attachment and early childhood distress, and none of them have been able to give me a satisfactory account of why Leva Saloon could not be reached by 17 months of trained professional intervention, went to sleep against the knee of a man who cleans floors. The best account I opted came from one of the specialists, a quiet woman named Perel Voth, who came highly recommended and who sat in my office and read the observation notes with a great deal of attention, and then set them down and said, he wasn't trying to fix her. I said that I wasn't sure I understood. She said everyone else was trying to fix her. The nannies, the behavioral institute, the protocols. They came in with something in their hands. A method, a procedure. And she knew it. She could feel it. She's 4 years old. She's not less than she is. She tapped the observation notes. This man came in with a rag and a song. He didn't want anything from her. He wasn't solving her, he just was there. I noted this in the file and thanked her. I paid her consultation fee, which was considerably lower than Drathviun's. Leva Saloons has slept through the night for 4 consecutive months. The rag rabbits, there are 7 of them now. Dael folds a new one every few mornings, are lined up on the low shelf beside her sleeping platform, in the order in which they were made. She refers to them, collectively, by a word that does not translate precisely from her early speech vocabulary into standard imperial. The closest equivalent is something like his. The Emperor sent a single handwritten note to my office last week. It said, in full, "Please ensure Morrow's corridor is the last on the morning roster, so he is not rushed. Note that his compensation has been reviewed and corrected upward. No formal announcement will be made." I confirmed receipt and entered the note into the record. Dael Morrow is, as of this writing, still listed in the palace staff directory under the heading Grounds Maintenance, Nursery Wing, Inner Oriath. His assessment remains satisfactory. He arrives at the 4th bell. He mops the corridor. At some point in the early morning, before the day staff arrive, he goes into the nursery. Shh. This morning I walked past him in the corridor on my way to the first meeting of the day. He was at the far end, moving the cart around the corner. I stopped. I had intended to simply pass. I do not have a reason to speak with ground staff. It is not usual, and I am a creature of what is usual. I stopped, and he looked up, and I said, "Good morning, Morrow." He said, "Good morning." I said, "How is she?" He considered this for a moment, the way he seemed to consider most things, without hurry, with the interest of someone for whom the question is worth a real answer. "She asked me this morning if the rabbit needed a name," he said. "All 7 of them." "What did you tell her?" "I told her they already had one." She asked what it was. He bent to the cart and straightened it against the wall. I told her it was whatever she wanted. He pushed the cart around the corner and out of sight. I stood in the corridor for a moment. Then I went to my meeting. The record is complete.